Ladies and gentlemen, when European institutions initiated justice system reforms in candidate countries and those undergoing political transformation, setting conditions, formulating recommendations, establishing standards, one concept consistently appeared at the heart of these efforts: judicial independence. It became a shared language of reform, linking the Council of Europe, the European Commission, advisory bodies, and expert networks. In these countries, the question of judicial independence relatively quickly assumed a concrete institutional form. In the process of accession to the European Union, the answer was, in practice, reduced to a single solution. The Judicial Council, a body intended to replace ministerial oversight of courts, insulate the judiciary from political influence, and raise the quality of education. The Euro model rested on several key assumptions. Constitutional states of the body, at least half of its seats reserved for representatives of the judiciary elected from among their peers. And GENIU, not merely advisory, decision-making powers encompassing the entire cycle of a judicial career. The aim of today's presentation is not to reject the very idea of a judicial council, but to ask what the experience of implementing this model, including in the Three Seas region, has revealed. The literature indicates that the adoption of the Euro model during the accession process resulted from several forces: external pressure and conditionality from European institutions, transactional expert networks, but also internal demand from domestic actors who saw in the new model an opportunity to consolidate their own position. This makes the region a particularly interesting field of observation. The model was implemented here rapidly, on a broad scale, and under conditions of far deeper political transformation than in Western Europe. Exposing tensions that had previously remained largely invisible, it is these tensions that I wish to address today. Firstly, European standards of judicial governance are shaped through a process that, from a normative perspective, requires closer examination. They are formulated primarily by specialized advisory bodies and expert networks: the Consultative Council of European Judges, the European Network of Councils for the Judiciary, and the Venice Commission. In all of these bodies, judges hold a dominant voice, and in some, an exclusive one. The result is a situation in which the same professional community substantially co-shapes the standards governing its own profession. The natural objection: who better than judges to define how the judiciary should function? Concerns not competence, but the legitimacy of the process. As Michał Bobek and David Koszarz point out, the standards of the Euro model never underwent democratic deliberation comparable to EU legislation or treaty making. They were developed largely outside the democratic process by a narrow circle of judges and officials of supranational organizations. Neither the European Union nor the Council of Europe developed coherent normative foundations for the model they promoted. As a result, paradoxically, institutions designed as guarantees of the democratic legal order were shaped through a procedure that does not fully correspond to that order. Secondly, if one examines more closely the documents defining the Euro model, EU documents, Council of Europe recommendations, Venice Commission opinions, a clear asymmetry becomes apparent. The dominant objective attributed to judicial councils is the protection of the institutional independence of the judiciary vis-à-vis the executive and the legislature. This is a legitimate aim. The problem, however, is that the question of accountability towards society, towards litigants, towards judges themselves remains marginal. The model essentially does not provide mechanism protecting a judge from internal pressure. It does not limit the participation of court presidents in the council's composition, does not guarantee proportional representation of lower instance judges, and does not create clear safeguards against the concentration of power in the hands of a narrow group of senior figures. As a result, a judge's independence from their own professional community and the judicial hierarchy remains poorly protected. And it is precisely this independence, termed by Kosas micro-independence, that is the precondition for an independent resolution of any given case. The tension between autonomy and accountability is not, moreover, specific to the region of transformation. Elaine Mack, analyzing France, the Netherlands, and Germany, demonstrates that the collision between classical rule of law values and efficiency-oriented governance is a structural phenomenon in all developed democracies. The difference being that in established system, this tension accumulated gradually over decades rather than having to be resolved simultaneously with building the foundations of an independent judiciary. Thirdly, the Euro model was promoted as a ready-made solution applicable across different contexts. The assumption of its transferability was built into the accession process itself. The problem was that it was not accompanied by an equally clear question: what conditions must be met for this transplantation to prove effective? In post-communist societies, a problem made itself felt that Zdenek captured in the metaphor of the inverted pyramid. The higher the level of the judicial hierarchy, the greater the proportion of judges professionally formed under the previous regime. Judicial councils were introduced in many countries before any real renewal of personnel or change in institutional culture had taken place. And it was precisely those cadres that took over the newly established structures, entrenching within them the very practice that the reforms were meant to eliminate. This is clearly visible in the cases of Slovakia and Romania. In both instances, the introduction of the Euro model Judicial Council did not bring about the expected depolitication. Instead of external political pressure, there emerged internal professional oppression, nepotism in appointments, and a concentration of power inimic to transparency. As Szipulova and Spacz demonstrate, the change in institutional form did not sever informal networks of dependency. It simply gave them a new constitutionally entrenched shell. What was important was the skeleton of the institution, not its spirit. The authors most frequently cited in the critical literature Michał Bobek, David Koszarz, Katarina Szypulowa do not claim that the Judicial Council model is inherently flawed. The conclusion is more nuanced, yet consequential. The sequencing of reforms is of fundamental importance. First, the independence and impartiality of the individual judge must be secured, and only then should a judicial council be established as an institutional guarantee of the autonomy of the third branch of government. If the sequence is reversed, if a grand institution is built before a professional culture and proper selection of personnel have taken shape, formal organizational autonomy may coexist with a deeply dependent judiciary. Reforms consisting in the introduction of transparent appointment and promotion procedures, open access to the profession, random case assignment, or the publication of judgments. This is harder to present to the public than the establishment of a new constitutional institution. Yet it is precisely that built lasting foundations. The ultimate measure of a successful reform, as Koszarz argues, is the capacity for an independent and impartial resolution of a given case, not the institutional autonomy of court leadership as such. The Three Seas region occupies a distinctive place in this debate. The experience of implementing the Euro model on a broad scale under conditions of the political transformation has exposed its weak points. A focus on institutional architecture at the expense of real guarantees of independence at the level of the individual judge, the susceptibility of formal mechanism to internal capture, and the assessment of reforms through the lens of formal compliance at the expense of informal institutions that in practice co-shape the functioning of courts. This is not solely a story of fair years. It is empirical material that allows us to pose questions that comfortable established Western systems have not yet had to ask. This perspective deserves a place in the broader discussion of judicial governance in Europe, not as a voice of dissent, but as a contribution to a rigorous reflection on the limits of harmonization and the conditions that effective reform must fulfill. Thank you for your attention.